A group of arrogant young men, full of contempt for others, decided to bully an elderly black man in the middle of the street. What they didn't realize, however, was that this old man was a Vietnam War veteran who had faced both the brutalities of war and countless personal losses that words could never fully convey. Watch as he teaches them a life-altering lesson. A lesson not just about true strength, but also about kindness and respect. Where are you watching this from? Share your thoughts and hit subscribe to never miss out on stories as profound as this one. Night had fallen, and darkness enveloped the streets of Baltimore in a soft golden hue from the street lights lining the taverns scattered along the sidewalks. The damp brick pavement reflected the shimmering light, creating uneven patches that looked like blurry oil paintings. Outside the Old Haven Tavern, the air was lively, filled with the raucous sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and, occasionally, the faint strains of country music drifting from a small speaker inside. In the midst of it all, an elderly black man named Mr. Benjamin quietly walked along the sidewalk. His frame was lean, slightly hunched, yet each step he took was steady, as though he was well accustomed to weathering life's storms. He wore an old wool coat, its creases telling the story of countless winters gone by. His worn leather shoes, though scuffed at the heels, were meticulously polished, a reflection of a man who valued diligence and self-respect. In his hand, he firmly held a wooden cane, its surface marked with scratches, small, silent witnesses to untold tales. His gaze was distant, not settling on anyone or anything in particular. It was the gaze of someone who had seen too much of life, too much loss, yet had somehow preserved an unshakable calm. Passers-by glanced at him, some with fleeting curiosity, but none lingered. In their hurried world, he was just a small, passing silhouette, unremarkable and easy to overlook. A middle-aged man leaning against the tavern door took a slow drag of his cigarette, his eyes briefly flickering to the old man before returning to the glowing screen of his phone. On that sidewalk, Mr. Benjamin wasn't anyone special, yet there was a quiet gravity to his presence, a subtle air that hinted he carried a story, one that people couldn't quite guess, but also couldn't fully ignore. Ahead of him, the flickering lights of the tavern reflected off the damp bricks. In the distance, the loud laughter of a group of young men rang out, laced with a sense of recklessness, amplifying the boisterous energy of Baltimore's night. But Mr. Benjamin's steps remained measured, unaffected by the noise. He didn't know it yet, but just a few more steps would place him at the center of a story, one that neither he nor anyone else on that sidewalk would ever forget. The atmosphere outside the Old Haven Tavern buzzed with laughter and chatter, but cutting through the noise was the rowdy commotion of a group of young men loitering near the main entrance. Leading the group was Derek, a tall, wiry guy clad in a faded, frayed denim jacket. The holes in the shoulders weren't signs of wear, but deliberate styling, a touch he believed made him stand out. His hair was slicked back and spiked, gleaming under the streetlights, a testament to his meticulous effort to grab attention. Beside Derek stood Tommy, a smaller, timid figure. Tommy rarely spoke, his eyes constantly flicking toward Derek, seemingly seeking approval. He trailed Derek like a shadow, hoping to find in this group the sense of belonging he had never found at home or school. The third member, Rico, had a stocky build and a backward baseball cap perched on his head. Arms crossed, his muscles flexed as if to declare to the world that he was strong and not to be trifled with. Yet in his eyes lingered a hint of insecurity, as though his tough exterior masked deeper fears. Derek leaned against the wall, a beer bottle in hand, laughing loudly at one of Rico's trivial stories. But his laughter wasn't pure amusement. It carried a hint of challenge, as if he was constantly asserting his dominance over everyone around him. Then Derek's eyes fixed on something. Mr. Benjamin, an elderly man in a weathered wool coat, ambled down the sidewalk with the aid of a wooden cane. Derek squinted, assessing the man for a brief moment before a smirk curled his lips. Elbowing Tommy, Derek tilted his head toward Mr. Benjamin. "Hey, check out that old man, walking like he's lost in some bygone era. Should we go?" "Greet him?" Tommy, hesitant as always, stole a quick glance at the old man and offered a nervous chuckle. "Come on, Derek. He's just an old guy." But Derek ignored Tommy's reluctance. Turning to Rico, he called out loudly, "Hey, Rico, doesn't he look like the type who'd try to teach kids like us some life lessons? What do you think?" Rico burst into laughter. "Yeah, bet he's never seen kids like us before." Derek took a swig of beer, his gaze locked on Mr. Benjamin like a predator eyeing its prey. There was no particular reason for Derek to target the old man, but to him, the man's calm and unbothered demeanor was a silent provocation. In Derek's mind, everyone in the world should either fear him or admire him. But Mr. Benjamin, with his unhurried stride and complete disregard for Derek's presence, inadvertently pricked at the young man's fragile ego. Taking a deliberate step forward, Derek hurled the empty beer bottle into a nearby trash can, creating a loud clatter to grab attention. He called out mockingly, "Hey, old man, where you off to in such a hurry? Careful not to trip. Nobody's gonna help. You up." Rico erupted into raucous laughter, while Tommy froze, glancing nervously at Mr. Benjamin and growing increasingly uneasy. Yet he remained silent, too afraid to speak up. Derek's smirk widened as he stepped closer, blocking the old man's path. Crossing his arms, he cocked his head and sneered, "Looking for something? Or maybe you're lost? Should I call you a cab?" Nearby, a few onlookers inside the tavern peered through the windows at the scene. None of them stepped out to intervene. They simply watched, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Mr. Benjamin maintained his calm demeanor. He showed no signs of being rattled by the taunts. His composure only fueled Derek's irritation, as though the old man's silence was a deliberate act of defiance. Taking another step forward, Derek's voice dropped, sharp and cutting like a blade. "Did you hear me, old man? Or are you deaf now?" At last, Mr. Benjamin stopped walking. He didn't look at Derek, but his hand tightened slightly around his cane. His gaze remained distant, as if lost in thought. The air grew heavy with tension, silence wrapping around the small corner of the street. A waiter inside the tavern hesitated at the door, seemingly considering stepping out but stopping short, unsure. Derek, wearing his trademark smirk, was utterly unaware that he was about to encounter a lesson far greater than anything he had ever anticipated. Derek, feeling like he had gained the upper hand, took a few more steps forward, blocking Mr. Benjamin's path. He crossed his arms over his chest, his voice rising above the din of the pub's noise. "Hey, old man, walking alone at this hour? Watch your step. No one's going to help you if you fall." Mr. Benjamin, with his usual calm demeanor, paused briefly. He neither looked at Derek nor showed any sign of annoyance or fear. His eyes flicked momentarily to the ground ahead, as if considering his next step. Then, with quiet resolve, he veered slightly to the right, his wooden cane tapping softly against the cobblestones in a steady rhythm. His indifference felt like a cold slap to Derek's pride. The sense of being ignored stoked a fire in him, turning his smirk into a sneer brimming with defiance. "Did you hear me, old man? Or are you deaf already?" Derek growled, stepping in front of him again. A few passers-by slowed down, their curiosity piqued by the brewing confrontation. A middle-aged man near the pub's entrance shook his head but said nothing. Some whispered among themselves, but no one stepped in to intervene. Tommy, standing behind Derek, hesitated. His voice was low and uncertain. "Derek, come on, man. He's just an old guy. Don't make a scene." But Rico, always Derek's partner in crime, grinned and egged him on. "Hey, don't let him ignore you like that, Derek. Show him some respect." Derek shot Rico a glance, seeing the mischievous encouragement in his burly friend's eyes. It fueled his wounded ego, the words feeding his simmering indignation. Derek's laugh was cold as he retorted mockingly, "You think you can just brush me off, old man? Not a chance." He stepped closer, planting himself squarely in front of Mr. Benjamin, arms crossed tightly, feet spread in a deliberately confrontational stance. His voice grew louder, oozing arrogance. "Where are you off to in such a hurry? Careful you don't trip over that stick of yours." Mr. Benjamin finally stopped, neither moving forward nor sidestepping. His hand gripped the cane lightly, his gaze calm and composed. The air around them thickened, the tension swallowing the usual background noise. Rico folded his arms, laughing boisterously, while Tommy looked down at the ground, visibly uncomfortable. Derek, sensing the crowd's attention, grew more animated. "What's the matter? Too scared to say anything? Hey, I'm just messing around. Don't take it so seriously." Derek jeered, his tone dripping with mockery. A young woman nearby, clutching her shopping bags, frowned slightly. She seemed ready to leave but lingered, her hesitation betraying her curiosity about how this would unfold. A scruffy-looking man in a wrinkled shirt sighed and muttered under his breath, "This isn't going anywhere. Kids these days have no respect." But no one spoke up or intervened. They all chose to watch from the sidelines, as if it were a part of social etiquette to observe, but not engage. Mr. Benjamin slowly lifted his head, his eyes finally meeting Derek's. There was no anger, no distress, no fear, just the steady gaze of someone who had seen much, endured more, and would not be easily cowed. His voice, low and steady, rang out like a bell in the charged air. "Young man, do you think shouting and blocking someone's path makes you strong?" For a fleeting moment, Derek faltered. The old man's calm words and unwavering gaze cut through his bravado like a knife. But he quickly masked his hesitation with a sneer, his tone dipping into defiance. "What did you say? Old man, you don't know who I am, do you?" Mr. Benjamin remained composed, ignoring the question. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, speaking slowly, each word weighing heavier than the last. "You have no idea what real strength is, but you'll learn. Perhaps the hard way." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a warning. Derek clenched his fists. His pride stung. Behind him, Tommy whispered urgently, "Derek, seriously, don't do something stupid." Even Rico, despite his earlier amusement, seemed uneasy as he glanced at Mr. Benjamin. But Derek wasn't ready to back down. To him, this wasn't just a minor altercation. It was a chance to prove himself, to assert his dominance in front of his friends, the onlookers, and even his own insecurities. He took another step forward, so close now that he was nearly nose to nose with the old man, his eyes blazing with challenge. But in that charged moment, Derek failed to see what others might have. He wasn't just facing an elderly man with a cane. He was standing against someone who had weathered storms far greater than any clash Derek could comprehend. Mr. Benjamin stood upright, his hand gently gripping the head of his wooden cane. He gazed at Derek, his eyes carrying neither anger nor confusion. They were calm, but seemed to pierce through the arrogant facade of the young man before him. "Young man," he said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the bustle outside the tavern. "Never underestimate someone just because they remain silent. Respect is a lesson that often comes at a very steep price." Those words, though spoken softly, cut through the already tense atmosphere like a chill wind. Derek hesitated briefly, the mocking smirk on his face faltering for just a moment. But Derek was not the type to back down easily, especially with his friends watching and the curious eyes of bystanders fixed on him. He burst out laughing, turning to Tommy and Rico with a sneer. "Did you hear that? This old man thinks he can teach me a lesson. What a joke." Rico laughed along, but his laughter lacked its earlier ease. His eyes darted briefly to Mr. Benjamin, then back to Derek with a hint of hesitation. Tommy, on the other hand, stepped back slightly, not laughing, his gaze flickering uncertainly toward the old man. Unaware of the subtle shift in the air around him, Derek took a step closer, his face now almost inches from Mr. Benjamin's. "And who do you think you are to talk to me like that? Some old geezer with a cane, trying to tell me how to live my life?" Mr. Benjamin didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as though carefully weighing his words. After a brief pause, he spoke again, his tone deliberate yet firm. "You can shout, mock me, but that doesn't make you stronger. What you call strength, your arrogance and laughter, is just a mask. Sooner or later you'll see that. If not today, then one day." The words cut into Derek's pride like a small, sharp blade. His expression flickered with confusion for an instant, before he quickly masked it with his usual smirk. "You're good, old man. But I'm not wearing any mask. I am who I am," Derek said, laughing loudly, his voice rising. He turned back to Rico and Tommy. "What do you guys think? This guy's lecturing me. Who listens to some senile old man ramble about life, huh?" Around them, a few passers-by began to pause. A young woman walking her small dog slowed her pace, her eyes filled with curiosity. A middle-aged man near the tavern door raised his beer mug to take a sip, but stopped midway, focusing intently on the scene. A waiter stepped out of the tavern, a glass cleaning towel in hand, stealing a nervous glance toward Mr. Benjamin and Derek, but saying nothing. The confrontation had become more than just a clash between two people. It was now a spectacle that captivated everyone present. Yet no one intervened. Mr. Benjamin remained unmoved by Derek's ridicule. His hand tightened slightly on his wooden cane as his eyes locked onto Derek, unyielding. His voice dropped lower, tinged with weariness but no less sharp. "Young man, you don't have to listen to me, but remember this. Every action has consequences. If you refuse to learn respect, life will teach you, and when it does, the price will be far greater." Derek took a small step back, his eyes wavering momentarily, but almost immediately he forced himself to regain his swaggering demeanor. "Oh, you're threatening me now? Fine. I'm not scared of anything, least of all some old man." By now, Rico was visibly uncomfortable. Though he kept up a smile, his eyes occasionally darted toward Tommy, as if seeking reassurance. He muttered just loud enough for Derek to hear. "Come on, Derek. Maybe this isn't worth it." Tommy, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, gently tugged at Derek's sleeve. "Derek, seriously, let it go. Just let the guy be." But Derek brushed Tommy's hand aside, his eyes flashing with anger. "I'm the one in charge here. Not you, and definitely not this old man." Turning back to Mr. Benjamin, Derek raised his voice as if to drown out the unease creeping into his mind. "All right, old man, if you're so wise, prove it. You've talked enough." The space outside the tavern fell utterly silent. Even the murmur of laughter and chatter from inside seemed to fade. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the old man and the young upstart. Mr. Benjamin regarded Derek with an expression that now carried more than just calm. It radiated a quiet power beyond comprehension. Slowly, he placed his cane on the ground and took a step forward, not to confront, but to deliver words that silenced everyone. "What do you want me to prove? That I can retaliate? Strike you? I don't need to do that. But I will show you this. Strength doesn't come from your fists or your shouting. It comes from controlling yourself and having the courage to face the truth." The simplicity of his words struck like a hammer, leaving Derek momentarily speechless for the first time. No one could tell, but this was the moment when everything began to change. Derek burst into laughter, his voice breaking the brief silence. But his laughter didn't faze Mr. Benjamin. The old man remained standing, his gaze slightly lowered, looking past Derek rather than at him. It was as if his mind had wandered far from the present, back to a realm of memories where darkness and light converged in a moment lost to history. In his mind, scenes from the Vietnam War unfolded like an unending film. The sound of helicopter blades slicing through the air, the distant echoes of exploding bombs, and the sharp crackle of gunfire mixed with the cries of young soldiers. The dense jungle, once his battlefield, came alive vividly in his thoughts. Towering trees seemed to block out the sun. He recalled the sensation of wading through muddy waters, sweat soaking his back, and the labored breathing of comrades running close beside him. Life and death were separated by the thinnest of margins. A face emerged in his memory. Michael, his closest friend in the unit, the one who had shared every crumb of bread and cigarette during their most harrowing days. Michael, with his confident smile, had sacrificed himself in an ambush to save the team. The last time Mr. Benjamin had seen him, Michael lay motionless on the ground, his eyes open but empty. The pain of that loss never faded. It etched itself into his heart like a scar, a constant reminder of how arrogance and carelessness could lead to irreversible consequences. A distant car horn snapped Mr. Benjamin back to the present. He blinked, his gaze refocusing on Derek, the young man standing before him with taut shoulders and a cocky smirk. In Derek's eyes, Mr. Benjamin saw a reflection of his younger self. He, too, had once been arrogant, believed himself invincible, and mistaken others' silence for weakness. But the battlefield had taught him otherwise. It taught him that recklessness didn't make one strong. It made them fragile. He shook his head slightly, as though to dispel the memories crowding his mind. His voice, no longer cold, but tinged with quiet sadness, broke the tension. "You remind me of myself when I was young, arrogant, careless, thinking the world owed me something. But let me tell you this, the world owes you nothing." Derek hesitated for a moment. There was something unsettling in the old man's eyes, not anger, not reproach, but a profound weariness that confused him. Yet his ego overpowered his doubt. Forcing a grin, he spoke louder, masking his unease. "Go on, old man. What do you think you know about me? You don't know anything." Behind him, Rico and Tommy were no longer as confident. Tommy glanced around nervously and whispered, "Derek, stop. This guy isn't like the others." Rico said nothing, but a flicker of unease crossed his face, as if his initial bravado had been replaced by a vague sense of dread. Mr. Benjamin stared at Derek for a long moment, silent. Then he stepped forward, his wooden cane tapping softly against the pavement. His voice, now low and weighted with gravity, carried across the space between them. "You think I don't know you? I don't need to. I don't need to look into your family, your friends, or your past to see that you're lost. I was once like you, Derek, thinking that raising my voice or mocking others made me stronger. But strength doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from restraint, from knowing your own limits." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The old man's gaze was like a mirror, reflecting the weaknesses he worked so hard to hide behind a facade of bravado. The onlookers no longer stood idly by. A few murmured among themselves, their eyes wide with surprise and admiration. A middle-aged man near the bar's entrance shook his head and muttered to the server beside him, "That old guy isn't ordinary. He's probably been through things these kids couldn't even imagine." The server nodded slightly, their gaze fixed on Mr. Benjamin and Derek. The atmosphere outside the bar seemed frozen in time. An unspoken battle was taking place, not one of physical strength, but a clash between seasoned experience and youthful arrogance. Mr. Benjamin closed his eyes briefly, as if centering himself after the flood of memories. When he opened them again, his voice was firm and unwavering. "You think I'm just an old man unworthy of your respect, but that doesn't change who I am. One day you'll understand where true strength comes from, but I hope you won't have to pay too high a price to learn it." Derek stood still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, yet the arrogance within him hadn't been fully subdued. With a faint smirk, he replied, "Is that so? Prove it to me, old man. Show me you're stronger than I am." Another silence settled over the scene. Derek didn't realize he had just invited a lesson he would never forget. Derek lowered his voice, taking another step closer to Mr. Benjamin, his eyes glittering with arrogance. He pointed at the wooden cane, his tone mocking as he sneered, "Old man, is that cane for self-defense or just to keep you from falling flat on your face? What could you possibly teach me?" Behind him, Rico burst out laughing, his loud guffaws amplifying the air of ridicule. But as he laughed, Rico noticed the eyes of the bystanders fixed on him, some shaking their heads in disapproval. His laughter faltered, and an uneasy smile crept onto his face as his confidence wavered. Tommy, however, couldn't even muster a chuckle. He tugged gently on Derek's sleeve, his voice meek. "Let it go, Derek. He's just an old man. We don't need to do this." But Derek brushed Tommy's hand away as if swatting a fly, his voice rising. "Are you scared, Tommy? Afraid of an old man? Come on, look at him. That cane. What is it? His secret weapon?" Mr. Benjamin remained still, his gaze momentarily dropping to the cane in his hand. His calloused fingers tightened slightly around the handle, not in preparation for a fight, but to steady himself. He lifted his head, his eyes calm as a still lake. "You don't need to test me," he said, his voice slow but deliberate. "You think I'll use this cane to strike you? If that's what you believe, then you don't understand strength." Derek laughed loudly, but his laughter sounded forced, uneven, lacking the confidence it once held. Still, he tried to maintain his bravado, pointing at the old man with a sneering tone. "All right then, old man. Show me your strength. Don't just talk about it." Rico stepped forward hesitantly, leaning slightly toward Derek and speaking in a low voice, his previous bravado gone. "Hey, Derek, maybe you should stop. I'm not so sure this guy is someone we should mess with." Tommy stood behind them, his eyes darting nervously between Derek and the old man. He spoke tentatively. "Derek, we don't need to do this. It's just a regular evening. Let's just go." But Derek brushed off their advice, turning to glare at his friends, his eyes flashing with anger. "You guys are such cowards. We're just having fun. What's there to be afraid of with an old man who can't do anything?" Derek turned back to face Mr. Benjamin, his voice cold and full of defiance. "All right, old man. If you're so great, show me. Teach me about strength like you said. Here's your chance." The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath. The chatter inside the nearby bar faded, leaving only the soft hum of background music. A middle-aged man by the bar's door, who had been observing the scene silently, shook his head with a heavy look of disapproval. A young woman, walking her small dog, whispered to her boyfriend, "This is getting out of hand. Do you think we should do something?" Her boyfriend shook his head, his expression uncertain. "No, it's not our business. Maybe the old man knows how to handle it." The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of Derek's footsteps echoing on the brick-paved sidewalk as he moved closer to Mr. Benjamin. Mr. Benjamin didn't step back. He studied Derek for a long moment, his tired yet resolute eyes meeting the boys'. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a bell tolling in the stillness. "You think strength is being loud, mocking others, and picking fights with people you think are weaker than you. But I'll tell you this, that's not strength, that's fear. Fear that if you don't prove yourself, you'll disappear in the eyes of others." His words cut like a sharp blade, slicing through the fragile shell of Derek's pride. Derek's shoulders stiffened, his eyes flashing with anger. "You don't know anything about me," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of suppressed emotion. "You don't know who I am or what I've been through. You have no right to talk to me like that." Mr. Benjamin's calm never wavered, his gaze steady on Derek. But Derek, desperate to shield his ego, seemed to be losing control of his emotions. He pointed an accusatory finger at the old man, his voice trembling with indignation. "You think you're so great? You're just an old man, a useless old man with nothing but that broken cane." Derek's words hung heavy in the air, making the tension even more palpable. Tommy took a small step back, as if distancing himself from the situation. Rico, though standing still, betrayed his unease with his darting eyes. Mr. Benjamin remained unmoved. He tapped his cane lightly against the brick pavement, the rhythmic sound punctuating the silence. His voice, deeper now, carried an almost ethereal power. "You don't need to shout to prove your strength, but I can see it. You're afraid, not of me, but of yourself." Derek froze, his eyes widening. For a brief moment, he was at a loss for words, yet his pride wouldn't let him back down. "So what?" Derek muttered, his voice quieter but still defiant. "What do you want me to do? Bow down and apologize to you? Don't count on it." Mr. Benjamin shook his head, his eyes softening, though they remained firm. No, you don't need to apologize to me, but you'll have to face yourself, and I'm going to help you realize that right here, right now. His words resonated like a declaration, signaling that the true lesson was about to begin, not just for Derek, but for everyone watching. Mr. Benjamin set his wooden cane on the ground, leaning slightly toward Derek, his eyes sharp as knives. A heavy silence blanketed the space around them, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for his words. His voice, though not loud, carried the weight of unshakable conviction with every word. You think strength is about shouting and mocking others? Let me tell you what real strength is. It's having the courage to stand up for what's right. It's about humility, respecting others, even when no one forces you to. Derek froze momentarily, his feet unconsciously retreating a small step. It wasn't fear, but something about the old man's gaze, filled with experience and unwavering certainty, made him uneasy. Trying to regain his arrogant demeanor, Derek smirked, his voice tinged with defiance. You talk a good game, old man, but you don't know anything about me. Don't stand there, lecturing me like you've got me all figured out. He emphasized each word, yet there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. The way Mr. Benjamin looked at him, as though peering directly into his soul, left Derek unable to fully mask his apprehension. Rico, who usually stood by Derek's side, remained silent. His eyes darted between Derek and Mr. Benjamin, hesitation increasingly evident. Tommy, the smallest and most timid of the group, had taken another step back, head bowed, clearly unwilling to be part of this confrontation. Mr. Benjamin remained still, his hand resting lightly on the top of his cane, his shoulders square and unshaken by Derek's bravado. Locking eyes with the young man, his voice lowered, carrying a blend of sharpness and introspection. You're right. I don't know anything about you, but I don't need to know your past to see that. You're lost, not because you're not good enough, but because you don't understand what truly matters. You're letting your ego control you, and that will destroy you if you don't change soon. Derek clenched his fists, the feeling of being exposed stoking his anger. He spat out his words, his tone strained with a desperate need to protect his pride. You have no right to talk to me like that. You don't know what I've been through. Do you? Have any idea what my life has been like? His voice grew louder, but the confidence in it began to waver. It was no longer the voice of a victor, but of someone struggling to shield themselves from an uncomfortable truth. Mr. Benjamin shook his head gently, his tone calm yet resolute. You think you're unique? That you're the only one who's had to fight, to endure? I don't. Need to know the specifics of your struggles to recognize this. Anyone who feels the need to yell, to overpower others just to prove their worth, is afraid. And you, young man, are afraid. Derek's gaze faltered briefly. The old man's words pierced through the armor he had meticulously built over the years. A sense of confusion began to seep into Derek's mind, though he tried to mask it with a crooked smile. You think you're better than me? Derek sneered, his voice quieter than before. You think I have anything to learn from some old man who can barely stand straight? Around them, the onlookers were no longer passive spectators. They started whispering to each other, their eyes filled with curiosity and surprise. A man standing near the tavern door murmured to his companion, That old guy isn't ordinary. His words, they carry weight. Even I feel like there's something to learn from him. A young woman, holding a dog on a leash, standing on the edge of the crowd, gently gripped her boyfriend's hand, her voice low. "I thought someone should stop this, but seeing the old man, I'm not so sure anymore." At that moment, Mr. Benjamin lifted his wooden cane slightly off the ground, holding the head of the cane as if it were a point of balance. His unwavering gaze fixed on Derek, his voice steady and imbued with undeniable authority. "I don't need to be better than you, nor do I want you to feel lesser, but I want you to. Understand that life is not a stage for you to play the role of the strong man. Everyone has scars, Derek, but using them to hurt others will only destroy you first." Derek said nothing, his eyes flickering with internal conflict as he struggled to maintain his arrogant facade. Behind him, Rico now clearly sensed that the situation was no longer a joke. Quietly, he stepped back, his expression tinged with regret. Tommy, who had wanted to withdraw from the beginning, touched Rico's shoulder and whispered, "I told you, this isn't right. I don't want to be here anymore." Rico nodded, but didn't leave. Both of them stood still, their eyes fixed on Derek, waiting for something to shift. Derek glanced around and realized that the support from his friends was no longer as steadfast as before, but his ego was bigger than his fear. He turned back to Mr. Benjamin, meeting his gaze with defiance, his voice straining to reclaim control. "You talk a good game, but your words mean nothing to me. You're just an old man, and I have nothing to learn from you." Mr. Benjamin's smile was faint, but it wasn't mocking. It was the smile of someone who understood that the real battle wasn't against Derek, but against the arrogance that had chained him for so long. And the real lesson, he knew, was only just beginning. Rico stood nearby, his confused gaze shifting from Derek to Mr. Benjamin. He bit his lip and mumbled just loud enough for Tommy to hear, "Something's not right, Derek. That man, he's not normal. I don't think this is a good idea." Tommy, who had been wavering from the start, nodded, his voice low but steady. "He looks like he's been through a lot. We shouldn't keep going. I'm starting to feel uneasy." But Derek, swallowed by his pride and ego, ignored his friend's warnings. He spun around sharply, his eyes demanding authority over the group. "I'm not afraid of him. He can't do anything." His voice was loud, echoing, as though trying to drown out the growing unease within himself. Mr. Benjamin didn't react to the provocation. He maintained an unnervingly calm demeanor, as if Derek's words were nothing more than a gentle breeze. Slowly, he rested his cane on the ground, leaning on it as if to steady his stance. His gaze swept over Tommy and Rico, pausing briefly on each of them, as though assessing the young men before him. Then he turned back to Derek, his voice resonating, low but powerful. "No one said you should fear me, but perhaps you should fear yourself. Fear the way. Arrogance and anger are steering you." Mr. Benjamin's words struck a chord in Tommy, who could no longer stay silent. He took a small step forward, his uncertain eyes darting between Derek and the older man. His voice was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Derek, I think he's right. We shouldn't do this. This isn't a game anymore. We don't know who he is, and he's clearly not what you think." Derek spun around, his eyes flaring with anger. "What are you saying, Tommy? Whose side are you on?" Tommy lowered his gaze, remaining silent, but the small shake of his head said it all. Rico, who had always stood by Derek, now felt the situation spiraling out of control. He glanced at Derek, then back at Mr. Benjamin, his uncertainty evident. Taking a hesitant step forward, he tugged lightly at Derek's sleeve. "Derek, I think Tommy's right. He's not like anyone we've met before. I don't know what he's been through, but he's definitely not some frail old man." Derek yanked his sleeve away from Rico's grasp, his voice rising with frustration. "I don't need you telling me what to do. If you're scared, then leave. But I won't let him look down on me like this." Mr. Benjamin watched the scene unfold, his expression softening slightly. It was as if he no longer saw a defiant young man, but rather someone struggling with emotions he couldn't control. He shook his head gently, his voice tinged with understanding and a hint of sadness. "You're losing your friends, Derek, and you don't even realize it. You think shouting will. Keep them here, that being tough will hold them close. But you're wrong. True strength isn't about controlling others. It's about learning to control yourself." Mr. Benjamin's words cut through Derek's pride like a sharp blade. But instead of backing down, Derek felt cornered. "Shut up. You don't know anything about me. You have no right to tell me what to do," Derek shouted, his voice trembling, not just with anger, but with the fear of being exposed. Rico and Tommy stepped back, clearly unwilling to continue. Tommy turned to Rico and whispered, "We should leave. I don't want to see this go any further." Rico nodded, his eyes filled with worry. Yet neither of them moved, as though waiting for something to shift. The tension outside the pub was thicker than ever. The bystanders remained silent, their gazes fixed on the confrontation between the old man and the fiery young man. An older man inside the pub sighed and muttered under his breath, "That kid doesn't know who he's messing with. That old man, he's not just anyone." A young woman walking her dog turned to her boyfriend and asked softly, "Do you think he's okay? This looks like it's about to get out of hand." Her boyfriend remained quiet, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, but I think he knows what he's doing. We just have to wait and see." Derek stood tall, his fists clenched tightly, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and confusion. But beneath the bravado, he felt himself losing control. His pride was cracking, but he refused to let himself acknowledge it. Mr. Benjamin, still calm and composed, looked at Derek once more. His gaze seemed to pierce through the young man's defenses, touching the deepest fears buried within him. And he knew. The moment to teach the most important lesson was drawing near. Mr. Benjamin took another step, his wooden cane lightly tapping against the damp brick pavement of the sidewalk. His gaze, sharp as a blade, stayed fixed on Derek, not with judgment, but with understanding. It was as if he could see straight through to the young man's core. His voice rang out, calm, yet weighted with a gravity no one could ignore. "People like you, who shout the loudest, are often the most afraid. You're not scared of me. What you're truly afraid of is yourself. You're terrified that if you don't scream, if you don't act out, others will see the real you, weak, reckless, and immature." The words struck Derek like a dagger, cutting deep into his pride. He froze, his body stiffening. His eyes darted nervously, and his fists clenched tightly, though he made no move. Derek took a step back, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation he couldn't bear to admit. The crowd around them had gone silent, all eyes fixed on Derek. Some shook their heads quietly, but no one spoke. The silence only deepened the young man's embarrassment. Rico, always Derek's loyal ally, now stood frozen, his expression filled with discomfort. He glanced toward Tommy, seeking support. Tommy merely shook his head slightly, his gaze glued to the ground, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes, least of all Derek's or Mr. Benjamin's. "We should go," Tommy murmured, but Rico didn't respond. Rico turned back to Derek, for the first time realizing that the friend he had always thought of as the strongest among them might actually be far more fragile than he'd ever imagined. Derek forced himself to regain his arrogant posture, his voice louder but tinged with a tremor. You don't know anything about me. Don't stand there acting like you do." He looked around, seeking validation from Rico and Tommy, but both remained still. Their silence made Derek feel more isolated than ever, and for the first time, he began to doubt his place among them. He turned his gaze back to Mr. Benjamin, his eyes a chaotic mix of anger and helplessness, but the old man remained unmoved. Mr. Benjamin tilted his head slightly, his expression still calm. "I don't need to know your past, nor do I need to understand you better than you understand yourself. But one thing I know for certain. If you keep living like this, you'll push away everyone who cares about you. One day, you'll look back and realize you've lost everything, and when that day comes, you'll wish you had learned this lesson sooner." His voice wasn't loud, but each word struck directly at Derek's fragile ego. Derek dropped his gaze, his shoulders trembling slightly. He couldn't respond. The old man's words left him with nothing to counter. His grand sense of self, the very thing that had emboldened him to challenge the world, now lay in pieces under the weight of the truth. After a moment, Derek stepped back again, his hands fallen to his sides. He didn't look at Rico or Tommy or the crowd around him. He just stood there, lost in a swirl of confusion and shame. The atmosphere seemed to hang heavy in the air. A few people in the crowd nodded subtly, their expressions showing agreement with Mr. Benjamin. A young woman walking her dog whispered to her boyfriend, "This old man is something else. Did you see that? He didn't have to yell or use force, but his words, they really hit hard." Her boyfriend nodded, his eyes still on Mr. Benjamin. "He's not just teaching that kid a lesson, he's reminding all of us." Mr. Benjamin straightened his posture, his gaze still on Derek, but this time his eyes held not just sternness, but a hint of compassion. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his tone softer now. "But remember what I've told you today. Someday you'll understand, and when that day comes, I hope you'll know how to change before it's too late." Derek didn't respond. He stood motionless for a moment before turning on his heel and walking away without a word. Rico and Tommy quietly followed, their expressions somber and contemplative. As their figures disappeared into the distance, Mr. Benjamin let out a faint sigh, his hand gripping the wooden cane just a little tighter. The crowd remained still, as if all of them had just learned something profound. As Derek's silhouette faded into the distance, Tommy stepped forward hesitantly. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes darted quickly toward Mr. Benjamin, filled with both embarrassment and remorse. Taking a deep breath, his voice came out shaky but sincere. Sir, we're sorry. We didn't mean to." Behind him, Rico nodded, his shoulders slightly hunched. He whispered softly, almost too afraid to lift his gaze. "Yeah, we messed up. I don't even know how things got so out of hand." Mr. Benjamin regarded the two young men standing before him. His gaze softened, the calm in his eyes like a lighthouse in the middle of a storm, not accusatory, but simply empathetic and understanding. Gently, he placed his wooden cane on the ground, leaned forward slightly and spoke in a deep, measured tone that carried the weight of experience. Apologizing is the first step toward maturity. But remember, respect isn't something you give because it's demanded of you. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do. When you learn to respect others, you'll find that you're worthy of respect too. Tommy raised his head, a glimmer of hope shining in his eyes. His voice was clearer this time, though still tinged with uncertainty. We didn't know. I think we just wanted to have fun. But now I see how wrong it was. I truly apologize, sir." Mr. Benjamin nodded, a small but warm smile forming on his lips. "Fun never comes at the cost of hurting others, young man. But what matters is that you've realized this before it's too late. Remember, a sincere apology can mend a lot, but it's your actions afterward that truly define who you are." Rico stepped forward, meeting Mr. Benjamin's gaze for the first time. Taking a deep breath, his voice was slow but resolute. "You're right. We were wrong. I don't even know what I was thinking. Maybe I just didn't want to be left behind. Derek's always leading and I just followed. But now I see that I made the wrong choice." Mr. Benjamin nodded again, his gaze growing even kinder as he looked at Rico. His voice was gentle yet profound. "No one forces you to follow anyone. You have the power to choose your own path. But if you keep letting others lead you, you'll lose yourself. Remember, strength isn't in following the crowd. It's in standing up for what's right, even if you're standing alone." Tommy and Rico fell silent for a moment, as though they were absorbing the weight of Mr. Benjamin's words. Tommy bowed his head, but this time it wasn't out of shame. It was out of gratitude. He spoke softly. "Thank you, sir, for not yelling at us. You're truly a respectable man." Rico nodded in agreement, his voice steadier now. "We'll remember what you said. I promise this won't happen again." Mr. Benjamin smiled, his eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. His tone remained calm but firm. "Don't just remember. Act. The lesson today only matters if you truly change." The crowd, which had been silently watching, began to stir. A young woman wiped her eyes discreetly and whispered to her boyfriend, "It's rare to see someone speak to kids like that. I think he's not just teaching them, he's teaching me too." An older man standing nearby nodded quietly, his gaze fixed on Mr. Benjamin with admiration. He muttered to the person beside him, "That old man, he's not just talking, he's inspiring." Tommy turned to Rico and said softly, "Let's go. I think I've learned more today than I ever expected." Rico nodded, but before they left, both boys turned back to Mr. Benjamin one last time. Summoning the last bit of his courage, Tommy called out, "We'll try to change. Thank you, sir, truly." Mr. Benjamin gave a slight nod, his eyes gentle but resolute. "I believe in you. But don't let your promise be just words. Let your actions prove it." As Tommy and Rico walked away, their figures gradually disappearing into the distance, their steps carried a noticeable change. Mr. Benjamin's words had not only touched their hearts, but left an indelible mark on everyone present. As the crowd began to disperse, Mr. Benjamin leaned lightly on his wooden cane, his eyes gazing toward the night sky as though deep in thought. A faint glimmer of hope stirred within him, a hope that his words today had planted a seed of change in those young souls. Mr. Benjamin stood tall, his calloused hand gently brushing the top of his wooden cane. His gaze swept over the remaining crowd, from Derek, who was staring down at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes, to Tommy and Rico, two young men whose attitudes had completely shifted. He took a deep breath, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of the crowd before they dispersed. His voice rang out, not loud, but each word seemed etched into the stillness of the sidewalk. Kindness and respect don't make you poorer, but without them, you can lose everything. Derek remained standing there, his shoulders slightly slumped, his eyes fixed on the ground as though wrestling with himself. Mr. Benjamin's words echoed in his mind, each one like a steady drumbeat against his pride. He didn't dare say anything or look at anyone. His immense ego, once his weapon to face the world, had now become a burden that held him back. Tommy glanced at Derek, intending to say something but chose to stay silent. He knew his friend needed time to fully grasp the weight of what had just happened. Tommy and Rico lingered, their eyes following Mr. Benjamin as he turned and began to walk away. Their hearts felt heavy, but not with guilt anymore. This time, it was admiration. Tommy murmured, as if reminding himself, "He's truly different. I've never met anyone like him." Rico nodded, his gaze still fixed on the old man's retreating figure. "Not everyone can say things like that and make you want to listen. He wasn't angry, and he didn't scold us, but it's like he saw through every mistake I've ever made." The bystanders began to disperse, but their faces still bore traces of the moment they had just witnessed. An older man near the entrance of a bar watched Mr. Benjamin's figure disappear into the distance, sighed softly, and muttered, "Sometimes a lesson doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs patience and honest words." A young woman walking her dog turned to her boyfriend, her voice contemplative. "He wasn't just talking to those kids, he was talking to all of us." Mr. Benjamin walked slowly along the sidewalk, his wooden cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each step. His shadow stretched long under the soft yellow glow of the street lights, a silent witness to all that had just unfolded. At the corner of the street, he paused briefly and glanced back at the now dispersing crowd. His eyes lingered for a moment on Derek, then Tommy and Rico. Without saying a word, he gave a slight nod, a quiet yet deeply meaningful gesture. Tommy looked at Rico, and the two turned their gaze toward Derek. Tommy spoke softly. "We need to do something to prove he's right. I don't want to just apologize and leave it at that." Rico smiled faintly, and for the first time that evening his smile lacked any trace of arrogance. His voice was steadier as he replied, "I think we can start by living differently. I don't want to be someone like Derek, or even like the person I was yesterday." Derek remained still, but this time his eyes followed the old man's figure fading into the distance. Inside him, something stirred, not anger, but a tumultuous mix of regret and a burgeoning desire to change. Tommy and Rico walked away, their steps slow but more resolute. What they carried with them wasn't just an apology, but a lesson they knew would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Across the street, Mr. Benjamin's silhouette had melted into the darkness, but his words continued to resonate in the hearts of the young men and everyone else who had been there to witness the moment. The silhouette of Mr. Benjamin slowly disappeared at the end of the street, leaving behind a silence on the once bustling sidewalk in front of the pub. The golden glow from the street lights illuminated the contemplative faces of those who remained, each seemingly lost in their own thoughts. A middle-aged man standing near the pub's entrance took a drag from his cigarette, then murmured softly as if speaking to himself. He didn't just teach the kids a lesson, he taught us all. Sometimes the simplest things are the easiest to forget. Derek stood motionless, no longer arrogant or loud. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes were distant. It seemed, for the first time in his life, he was truly confronting the most hidden parts of himself, the fears he had always tried to mask with his prideful facade. Tommy's voice broke the silence beside him, gentle yet resolute. Maybe he's right. We need to learn respect, not just for others, but for ourselves too. Derek looked up at Tommy, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He didn't respond, but the faint nod he gave was an unspoken acknowledgement. For the first time, Derek didn't feel the need to prove anything. Rico placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, his expression softening, shedding its usual bravado. He spoke quietly. "Derek, we're young. We messed up. But if we start now, I think we can make it right." Derek didn't reply, but his gaze softened. Tommy, small in stature, yet now the strongest among them, turned to Rico and said, "I think we need to do something to make amends, not just apologize to him, but to everyone we've wronged." Rico nodded, agreeing wholeheartedly with Tommy for the first time. It wasn't just the group of teenagers. The witnesses, too, carried their own reflections. A young woman walking her dog whispered to her boyfriend, "Did you see that?" With just a few words, he changed the way so many people think. I think we should also reflect on how we treat those around us. Her boyfriend nodded, his voice contemplative. "He made me realize you don't need to yell or get angry to change someone. Sometimes all it takes is patience and sincerity." An older man, still leaning against the pub's doorway, smiled faintly and said, "An old man with a wooden cane. Who would have thought he'd be stronger than all of us?" As the scene outside the pub returned to its usual rhythm, Derek took a deep breath, as if summoning strength to move forward. He spoke softly, for the first time without trying to appear tough. "I'll need time, but I'll change. Not because he made me, but because I want to." Tommy smiled and placed a hand on Derek's shoulder. "You can do it. We'll do it together." Rico said nothing, but his slow nod spoke volumes. The three walked away, unhurried, but this time, each step carried a new determination. Their silhouettes gradually merged with the glow of the streetlights, leaving behind a quiet sidewalk brimming with lingering emotions. Mr. Benjamin, though gone, remained vividly present in the minds of everyone who had been there, a symbol of calm, understanding, and the power of humility. What he left behind wasn't just a lesson for the teenagers, but a reminder for everyone. Kindness and respect not only change others, but also help us become better versions of ourselves. From that night on, those who had witnessed the scene carried with them a profound reflection, a reminder that every kind act and every sincere word, no matter how small, has the potential to change a life. The story of Mr. Benjamin wasn't just a lesson for Derek, Tommy, and Rico. It was a heartfelt reminder for all of us. In life, kindness and respect don't just build meaningful relationships, but also help us become more admirable individuals.